She watched her world vanish beneath endless storms. Cities swallowed, forests shattered, oceans rising higher each dawn. Her people had given up, convinced their beautiful world was doomed. But then a single human engineer arrived, armed not with weapons or magic, but with ideas. Blueprints, turbines, and sheer stubborn hope. Together, they defied the storms, turning despair into innovation and saving a dying planet, one brilliant design at a time. She stood on the edge of the shattered shoreline, her thin, bioluminescent fingers clutching a tattered cloak around her shoulders. Waves slammed against the rocks below, sending up spray that glowed faintly in the eternal lightning storms above. Her eyes, vast shimmering pools of teal, scanned the horizon with a haunted emptiness. She was one of the last daughters of Hydralis, a once flourishing waterworld now choked by endless cyclones and rising seas. For centuries, her people believed they were chosen, a blessed race that had tamed the oceans and commanded the rain. But now, every day felt like a funeral. The elders had gathered countless times, chanting ancient songs to beg the water gods for mercy. The priests offered floating lanterns that were swiftly swallowed by the waves. The warriors built walls of coral and steel, only to see them collapse under the fury of the storms. Each effort ended the same way, with more funerals, more empty homes, more silent prayers drifting into the thunder. She was young, barely past the first molt that marked adulthood. But the silver streaks in her hair, once a sign of wisdom, now marked her as a survivor of too many flood nights. Her name was Suraya, meaning song beneath the waves. Yet she hadn't sung in years. That morning, the final evacuation bells rang through the drowned streets. Whole families loaded what little they had onto floating platforms, hoping to drift inland to higher coral towers. But there was no true refuge left, the highest reefs were already submerged. Suraya walked alone among the remnants of markets and shrines, her feet sinking into cold brine. She had lost her parents to a collapsed sea bridge. Her bond partner had vanished in a mudslide. She had no one left to follow, no reason to run. It was then that she saw it, a strange ship, alien in shape, floating effortlessly above the water. It didn't tremble against the wind or lurch in the heavy surf. Instead, it glided smoothly, almost arrogantly, as if the storms were nothing but a drizzle. She stood frozen, watching the vessel lower a landing ramp that glowed with steady, calm lights. From it descended a figure clad in a reflective suit, bearing a helmet with a mirrored visor. At first, she thought it must be a god come to judge them at last, or perhaps a final scavenger here to loot what little remained. But when the figure removed the helmet, she saw a face she had only seen in forbidden transmissions and archived warnings. A human, skin sun-browned, hair tied tightly back, eyes scanning her with an intensity she'd never known. "Is anyone here?" he called out, his voice cutting through the howling wind like a blade. Suraya didn't answer. She only trembled, her hands grasping at her soaked cloak. He stepped closer, struggling against a sudden gust. "I'm an engineer. My name is Isaac. I've come to help." She nearly laughed. Help? In this ruin? She had heard of humans, creatures from the stars who built vast cities among the void and who terraformed entire moons. Yet her people had always mocked them, calling them arrogant metal breathers, desecrators of nature. But now, as she looked around at her shattered world, that arrogance began to look like something else, a stubbornness that refused to surrender. Isaac looked into her eyes and seemed to understand without words. He crouched, opening a case from his belt and pulling out a small orb that whirred softly and projected shimmering images into the rain. Schematics of turbines, massive sea barriers, siphon networks that could drain floodwaters and stabilize coastal shelves. "I've seen worse," he said softly, a hint of a smile flickering. "We can fix this." Suraya shook her head violently. "It's too late. The gods have cursed us. The ocean is hungry, it wants us gone." Isaac reached out slowly, palm up, as though offering a fragile bird. "There are no curses, only problems we haven't solved yet. Let me try." In that moment, something inside her cracked. Perhaps it was the final break of a heart too long frozen. Perhaps it was the glow in his eyes that reminded her of starlight. She stepped forward and placed her trembling fingers against his hand. The next days blurred into a rhythm she had never known. Isaac never stopped, never paused to mourn, to collapse, to blame the wind or sky. He sketched designs in the mud, hacked old machine parts from flooded shipyards, taught her to solder and splice cables by the dim light of a portable reactor. When the storms knocked down a prototype turbine, Isaac didn't curse the heavens. Instead, he stood in the rain, sketching new designs on a soaked sheet of metal with a plasma cutter. When waves smashed the first siphon pump, he just grinned, adjusted the angle, and bolted it down again. Suraya felt her heart beat faster each day. At night, when they huddled together beneath the half-finished sea dome, he would tell her stories of Earth, of deserts turned into green forests, of rivers redirected to feed barren plains, of entire floating cities tethered to great ocean currents. Humans, he said, don't wait for miracles. We make them. As the first turbines began to spin and the first drainage channels began to shift the floodwaters, Surya saw something she had never dared imagine: the waterline receding, revealing black sand and broken shells. Small fish darted into newly formed pools instead of surging over drowned plazas. The few survivors who hadn't fled began to creep back, eyes wide and cautious. They watched the human work with the blue-skinned girl beside him. A girl they had once dismissed as doomed, or worse, cursed. Each evening, Isaac insisted they rest for at least a few hours. They sat by a tiny portable heater, sharing a ration pack. Surya learned to laugh again, a hesitant, delicate sound at first, then bright and strong. One night, after they rigged the final dome supports, she pressed her forehead to his. "Why help us?" she whispered. "Why not just leave us to drown?" Isaac looked at her with a gentle fierceness. "Because life, all life, is worth fighting for. And because I saw you standing there, and I knew I wasn't looking at a victim. I was looking at an engineer waiting to be born." A silent tear slipped down her cheek and vanished into her collar. She didn't have words for the warmth blooming inside her, a warmth stronger than any sunbeam. When dawn broke after a rare calm night, the entire first dome shone on the horizon, a glimmering sanctuary that refracted the pale morning light. The tide had pulled back far enough that new land was visible, wet and trembling but alive. For the first time in decades, the sky above Hydralis seemed to pause, its dark clouds no longer raging but drifting, as though the storms themselves were learning to breathe again. Surya stood beside Isaac, her cloak flaring in the salty breeze. Behind them, the turbines hummed, the siphons sang, and small groups of survivors began to gather tools instead of funeral cloths. She turned to Isaac and squeezed his hand. "I think the ocean is finally listening." Isaac chuckled, pulling her closer. "No, it's not listening. It's learning to respect us." Together, they looked out at the reborn coast. And for the first time, Surya believed, not in old gods or angry tides, but in the quiet, unstoppable force of human determination. And she knew that no matter how high the waves might rise again, they would face them. The weeks turned into months, and the skeletal ruins of Hydralis began to transform under the relentless, patient work of Isaac and Surya. Word of their success spread like phosphorescent algae in a midnight tide. Scattered survivors drifted back on battered boats and makeshift rafts, wide-eyed and hesitant at first. At first, they stayed at the edges of the new coastal platforms, huddled together as if expecting the storms to return and wash everything away. But when they saw Surya, the girl they once called cursed, the girl who had waited alone among crumbled temples, laughing beside the human, covered in mud and grease, something shifted deep within them. Surya became more than a symbol, she was a leader. She taught them how to weld pipes, how to balance the turbine rotations, how to read the strange diagrams Isaac scratched into sand or metal sheets. Slowly, her voice, once barely above a whisper, became strong enough to carry over crashing waves. One day, an elder approached her cautiously. His skin was faded, almost translucent from salt exposure, and he leaned heavily on a coral staff. He stared at the domes gleaming behind her, the turbines singing their mechanical songs. "You are no longer Surya, the silent one," he rasped, eyes shimmering with both awe and regret. "What should we call you now?" She looked at Isaac, who simply grinned and gave her a gentle nod. Turning back to the elder, she straightened her shoulders. "Call me Surya still. But now, let it mean builder of tides, not song beneath the waves." The elder bowed deeply, pressing his forehead to the ground. One by one, others followed, young and old warriors and weavers. In that moment, Hydralis was reborn not as a kingdom of trembling worshippers but as a settlement of dreamers and doers. Isaac, meanwhile, worked tirelessly on the main sea barrier, a towering ring of alloy and coral, designed to redirect the killer currents. It was dangerous, almost suicidal labor. Even with drones and exosuits, each day risked sudden collapses and rogue waves. During one fierce night of welding, lightning struck close to the barrier, sending molten shards flying. Surya rushed to him, panic gripping her heart, fearing she'd find him charred or swept into the abyss. But she found him standing tall, helmet off, eyes blazing with adrenaline and exhilaration. "Still alive," he shouted above the roar, offering her a soot-blackened hand. "We're close." Instead of pulling away, she threw her arms around him, clutching him as though he were the last warm flame in a world of ice. He hesitated only a moment before returning the embrace, his chin resting against her soaked hair. When the final segment of the barrier fell into place, a miracle unfolded. The seas beyond began to swirl and calm. The coastal waters, once violent and murky, turned clear enough that shimmering fish returned to dance among the reefs. Storm clouds lost their monstrous coils, drifting into gentler rains. Hydralis began to bloom. New towers rose from coral and alloy, their spires wrapped in living seaweed gardens. Floating farms sprouted, harvesting clean rainwater and fresh kelp. Children who had once known only terror now giggled as they splashed in shallow pools. Suraya's people no longer saw the ocean as a vengeful god but as a partner, unpredictable, yes, but worthy of respect rather than fear. One evening, under the glowing arches of the first completed shelter dome, Suraya and Isaac stood together overlooking the moonlit water. She wore a shimmering cloak of woven sea fiber, a crown of pearl shells resting on her head, a gift from the children she had saved. Isaac leaned against a railing, studying her with a softness that made her pulse flutter. "I never thought I'd find a home in a place like this," he murmured. "I came here expecting to teach, maybe fix a few machines. But instead, I found something worth more than all the stars." Suraya tilted her head, her silver-streaked hair catching the dome's soft lights. "And what is that?" He reached out, taking her hand gently in his calloused fingers. "A future I didn't know I wanted. With you. With all of them." Tears pricked at her eyes, but for once they didn't feel like salt-burned scars. She stepped closer, pressing her forehead to his. "You gave us more than technology. You taught us how to fight for ourselves, and for each other." They stood there in silence, their breaths weaving into the cool sea breeze. Around them, faint echoes of laughter and music rose from the rebuilt streets below. That night, Suraya gathered the elders and the remaining builders for one final ceremony. She led them to the shore where the first siphon pump had been installed, now a place of reverence. There, she placed a small, carefully carved coral sculpture, a figure standing beside a taller one, both gazing out at the horizon. "This," she announced, her voice ringing clear, "is not a god. It is not a sacrifice. It is a promise, that we will never again wait to be saved by miracles. We will build them with our hands, as he taught us." The people knelt in respect, not to worship but to commit themselves to that promise. As dawn broke, the light touched Isaac and Suraya where they stood on the barrier wall, watching the reborn coast. Fish darted in the shallows, plants clung to newly exposed rocks, and faint rainbows danced in the morning mist. Suraya turned to Isaac, her eyes glowing like deep ocean gems. "Will you stay?" she whispered. He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "There's nowhere else I belong." She pulled him into a fierce embrace, their hearts beating together, a living testament to the stubborn miraculous power of life and love. Under the rising sun, the once doomed ocean world of Hydralis finally found its second chance, not from a distant god, but from a human heart that refused to give up. And so, the girl who once stood alone in the storm now stood at the helm of her people's rebirth, with a human at her side, and a future they would build together, wave by wave, breath by breath.